We'll see. So before we start, who am I? I am the Senior Android Developer Advocate at Vonage. I've been an Android developer for about 12 years now. Yeah, for a while. And I've definitely been kind of an Android enthusiast throughout that, not just developing apps, also working on custom ROMs, and generally playing around with the Android operating system. I was am the lead of the Linux on Android project, and today I want to talk to you about kind of 4 lessons that I've learned through kind of trial by fire of what you shouldn't do if you want your Android project to last for the next 10 years. So where did it all start? Well, it all started with the HTC Magic, which I was planning to bring with me. I still have it, but unfortunately I forgot it. But like I say, I started in 2009. I bought my HTC Magic, and it kind of all went from there. It sparked my love for Android and the fact that finally we had a mobile operating system that you could write actual applications for, and also had the Linux kernel, which I found very interesting. So within kind of 6 months of tinkering, installing custom ROMs, having a play around, I started Linux on Android. And what is Linux on Android? It's basically was a way for you to run full GNU Linux distributions, like Ubuntu, on your Android device. It was done through a method called chroot, which basically was a way of telling the Linux kernel to change its root file system to a particular directory on your device. And it's still very commonly used even today. If you've got sort of Linux on your Chromebook, that's doing something very similar. So any platform where you have the Linux kernel, just because you might have Chrome OS or Android, doesn't mean you can't actually run traditional Linux applications on that device. You can, that's what the kernel is there for. And you could actually also run a GUI through some sort of virtualization like VNC. At one point, we were even kind of starting to progress that further into taking over the Android frame buffer and actually editing X11 to write out to the frame buffer and have kind of native GUI out. There was no hardware acceleration, but it was there. But most importantly, and the reason probably why this was quite a successful project, is it didn't touch Android. You weren't removing Android. You didn't have to change anything about Android. Well, you did have to do one thing, but you didn't have to change much about Android. And as far as the Linux system that you were creating was concerned, it was just a Linux device. It didn't care that Android was there, and Android didn't particularly care that Linux was there. But, like many things, it did require root. So there was that first step. You did have to root your device and kind of go down that route. But obviously, for a lot of people, they were doing that anyway at that time because Android was new and exciting, and everyone wanted custom ROMs. So how did we start the project? Does anyone remember what this looks like? Can anyone tell me what website this might be? It's XDA. So it was born on XDA, like pretty much anything to do with Android hacking. And it started as a very basic forum thread with some amazing graphics that you could use as your banner. And I was obviously incredibly good at graphic design as well. So that was very important for the project. What it really was, though, at the time was kind of just some command line scripts that you could run to set the environment up. You could do that through ADB, or you could use some sort of terminal emulator that also existed, and still does, on the device itself. But it was a script. You had to run it. You had to pass in some variables. It was not particularly user-friendly, and certainly for more of the probably more nerdier amongst us. So we progressed this whole process into a full-blown app. And this process integrated the downloading of the actual files that you needed, extracting those files, and essentially compiling a Linux image file that you could then just mount run your Linux software, whatever you want to do, and then unmount it, and you just had a file that you could save and was quite convenient. This app, and of course, one of the things that's very important here is it featured the height of UI design at the time, which was the dashboard layout. Very important. But we did continue to improve the app and revise the processes and revise the download methods and all that sort of thing. And this was very much iterative and non-stop. We removed the dashboard because it was a pretty terrible UI. And of course, we introduced the next new amazing UI for Android, which was the slide-out menu. And it was, again, the most amazing thing at the time and so important. Then, because it was 2013 and everyone was doing it, we were on Kickstarter. And we had a very successful Kickstarter campaign. What that meant is we kind of generated enough interest and enough donations that we could actually focus full-time for a number of months as a developer team of about 3 of us to try and produce V3 of the app and also the in-process. We had a whole roadmap of lots of things we really wanted to do. It was a very exciting time for the project. We updated the slide-out menu so that we had an even more interesting layout with vector graphics for the icons and all these sorts of fancy, fun things at the time. I'm not entirely sure why the screenshot. This was literally a screenshot that I took the other day. This is the current version of the app before we've started changing anything. And I'm not entirely sure why they're purple. If anyone can tell me, that would be very interested to know, because they certainly weren't at the time. We also completely removed the paid version. We had a free version of the app and then a version of the app that you could buy as kind of just a donation. It didn't actually give you anything else, but you were donating to the project. So we removed that, and instead we did put some adverts into it. You can actually see the bottom-hand corner, the small banner ad, and then there was an in-app purchase to remove those. We also completely open-sourced the project. So up until now, the scripts and the whole actual process, that was all open source, that was all documented. But the app itself was closed source and kind of the proprietary element. We changed that. We decided, no, we want this to be a completely open source project. And we also went with the brilliant idea of hosting it on SourceForge. But it was incredibly successful. We had over 1 million downloads of the app itself. We had, at the peak, over 100,000 active installs, so people were actually using it. They weren't just downloading it. And we got featured in a Linux magazine in the UK called Linux Format. Media kind of started to pick this up as something interesting for both Android enthusiasts, but also Linux enthusiasts who wanted to be able to run their favorite command line application on the go, because people apparently did actually want to do that, and it was quite widely wanted. So the project was going really well. This was maybe 2014 at the time. It was something that we as a team of 3 were really passionate about and really wanted to continue with, but then life happened. I was offered a job with a telecommunication company in Australia who were building a tablet that was basically going to feature this functionality. The idea was you'd have an Android tablet, and this is the sort of tablet. When you docked it, you'd have a desktop monitor, keyboard, mouse attached, and you'd have a full Ubuntu environment that you could use as your desktop computer. I believe the kind of intended audience was office workers who wanted to be able to hot desk and just bring their tablet wherever they went. It was also going to introduce things like a VoIP phone as well, so you could take your office phone with you wherever you were, and all these kinds of extra features. But ultimately, it didn't gain any traction. I'd like to say through no fault of my work, but who knows? But it didn't gain any traction. We did hit prototype. I still have some of them at home. They make very good paperweights. So, there's still a use for them. But they are Android tablets running like Android 4, and to be honest, I haven't turned them on in a very long time. So from that, I went on to be an Android freelance developer. This was kind of the time when every business wanted an Android app. Most businesses didn't have a use case for an Android app, but they still wanted an Android app. So there was a lot of work available. There was lots of stuff to do as a freelancer. It meant I could kind of continue this lifestyle, but it meant that I didn't have the time available to continue working on an open source project. I also got married, which is definitely not a negative thing. I'm very happy, but it did mean that I had even less free time and had other things that I valued more and were more important to me, like spending time with my wife. So what all of these things together meant was that I didn't have time for Linux and Android anymore. And so by the sort of end of 2015, essentially the project stopped. The other two developers that were on the project had similar things going on. They were going to college, they were getting jobs, they were doing other things that meant they didn't have time to maintain this anymore. So the project went stale, and we just didn't touch it. It still existed, but nothing else happened with it. So that was maybe 6 years. It stayed like that. And in 2021, I think maybe like quite a few people, I had a bit more free time than normal because we were locked inside and needed to find things to do. So I started looking at this project again, and I thought, well, hang on a minute. What could I do now that I couldn't do then? Is there any interest still for something like this? And what I actually found is the app was still active, and there were still 10,000 active installs of the app. Now, bearing in mind, this was an app that hadn't been updated in 5 years. It had a terrible UI. It barely functioned anymore because of all the changes in Android, but people still wanted to use it, even if they actually couldn't, and definitely the ratings started to reflect that. It didn't have a very good review rating on the Play Store anymore, but people were still installing it and did still want to use this kind of project. So I thought, you know what? It's time we get back started on this project. Let's make a new version. Let's see if we need to start fresh. Let's see if we can recover anything. I mean, it had been 6 years since I'd touched it. I can't remember what happened last week, let alone what happened 6 years ago. I couldn't remember what the state of the project was in. But there was also something that I discovered quite quickly, that there was this new process of proot, which meant you didn't actually need real root anymore. You could do the kind of things we needed to do with chroot within the user environment that an application was given by Android and the Linux kernel. So there was this opportunity that actually this could become a much more accessible project because you no longer needed root. And on much more modern Android devices, you're punished quite significantly if you do root your device. Things like banking apps and that sort of thing don't work anymore, and so much fewer people are doing that, particularly on their main device. So it was time to dust off the code. Oh, that was a mistake. It was mirrored on GitHub, so we still had a version because SourceForge, but Android had come a very long way, so the code that we had was pretty terrible, and like I said, was barely functioning anyway. And it also looked like this. I don't know which of us had decided this was a good idea to try and columnize variables using indentation. I don't know where that style came from. I'm glad I don't remember, because it was probably me. And it looked a mess when I opened it up in Android Studio, and I just realized how much of a nightmare. Like, why was that ever readable? Why was that ever a good idea? The other issue we had is I did not have the key store for the original version that was on the App Store anymore. Who knows where that had gone? It had been 6 years. I'd changed computers a lot. It was not something I was thinking about. So there was this worry of, well, actually, can I even continue to use this version? Am I going to have to start fresh anyway? Do we rebuild or do we start again? So that was definitely a question that was in my mind this whole time. But it wasn't just the code that was an issue. Even just the web hosting, things had changed so much. The old website was using some random website hoster. It was using WordPress, which was painful, and it was very slow and quite expensive. It was something I was still paying for, but for what it was quite a mess. There was also the source code and the actual files that you needed to initialize this process, the root file system of Ubuntu, those sorts of things. Well, this is a screenshot of SourceForge. It's still up. And actually, if you can see, let me point, yeah, if you can see, this was taken this week. There was still over 1,000 downloads of the files. It was still being used. However, who actually uses SourceForge anymore to host code? You don't. It is just not something that exists anymore. So it was hosted on SourceForge, and that was also kind of an issue. It wasn't really something that anyone was going to be using. It wasn't going to get other people interested in contributing to the project. And then the final kind of big issue was communication. All communication used to be done on an IRC channel on Freenode. And if anyone knows Freenode, if anyone knows what's happened in the recent years, you'll know that that really isn't an option anymore and was really not going to be something that we could do anymore. So we had lost all communication with the users. We had no idea who was still using this. We had no way to contact them. And it was kind of a mess. I could see the numbers. I could see the statistics from the Play Store. I could see the statistics from SourceForge. I didn't know who was using it. I couldn't reach out to anyone and say, hey, look, we're back. Help us. It wasn't there. So all in all, I was scared. It was a nightmare. It felt like a daunting task that actually I was going to have to just completely rebuild this project and start fresh. So what lessons have I learned since starting fresh? Now, for the record, we haven't released a new version yet. It's still very much work in progress. As I hope you can see, there was a lot of work to do, and it's still just a open source, in my spare time project. But there are some lessons that I've learned, and those are the things I'd like to share with you because hopefully that will help you in future projects. So first off, architecture. It is vital to develop your app's architecture very early on. Define how you want your app to work, how it's going to look, and make sure you're enforcing that, particularly for an open source project. One of the mistakes that I made very early on is that as soon as someone wanted to contribute, I just let them. And there wasn't really much PR review, there wasn't really much going on, and so you end up with this kind of mismatch of code, which again is a nightmare. So enforce your app architecture, make sure people are working towards it. Also maintain documentation. This is something I didn't do. But it meant that when we stopped working on the project, no one else could pick it up, no one else knew what was going on. So make sure you have documentation and make it easy for other developers to get involved. Third parties. No platform stays on top forever. At the time, SourceForge was a great option. At the time, Freenode was a great place to chat. These things are not the case anymore, and who knows what it will look like in the next 10 years. Don't be too dependent on other platforms. Have a backup plan. Always make sure that you have some other option in the background. And that also is for your Android applications as well. Make sure your dependencies are actually required. You're not just kind of using a dependency for the sake of it. And make sure you have a backup plan. If that service you rely on goes down, what happens? The third point is probably very important because Android moves quick. A lot has changed in 10 years. A lot has changed in permissions. A lot has changed in UI design. A lot has changed in what the user expects of your applications. You don't need every bell and whistle. One of the biggest mistakes we made early on is we were trying to chase every UI change, every new big way of doing UX, when it was an application that really didn't matter about the UI. People just wanted it as a helper to get them into Linux. They didn't actually care what it looked like as long as it worked. But we were so obsessed with that that a lot of time was wasted doing that. Features, styles, best practices, these change. Make sure to review that through your application and consider what's important to your application, important to your users. Just because there's a big new fancy thing doesn't mean it's right for your application, at least not initially. And finally, the communication. Keep your communication lines open. Make sure that it's easy for others to help the project and find ways to get involved. And make sure that you have, again, communication channels change. We couldn't use Freenode anymore, but we didn't have a backup plan. So make sure that you have a backup plan. Now we use Discord. Well, that might change again in 5 years. So make sure you have ways of keeping your users informed that are possibly more resilient. Email isn't going to go away. It's always good to have a mail list. And that's it. I made it in 20 minutes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. If you do